So we want to get better at the creative process because it helps us generate better outcomes, better products, right? So we've spoken about a wide range of products already. We've talked about new uses for a Ziploc bag, for example. We've talked about how we might reduce gun violence. And earlier we spoke about ideas for new products like Burt's Bees, lip balm, and new services and more.
Yeah, I mean, and we often, when people talk about creativity, we hear all kinds of things like, I had this creative idea, or I had this great idea strike me the other day. And then sometimes we talk about creative products, right?
Right.
Did you see that thing at the store, or can you believe that thing that some company invented, right?
Right, so there's a wide range of different ways we talk about creative outcomes, right?
Yeah.
But it can start to get a little confusing as we start to, well, how do we compare a service to an idea to a product?
Yeah.
Are they really all the same thing, or are there some differences we should pay attention to?
Yeah, and so when I looked at the literature, it seemed as if there were some clean breaks that we could and would be useful to differentiate into three types. And so the first type for me is an insight, right? I have some, this is the idea, right? A light bulb goes off, or I have this notion that, instead of looking at it like this, we could look at it like that, right? Something about our perspective, our pages changes.
Right.
Or we have an idea about how it might change if we only could fill it out because we don't know. So insights.
But that's really kind of the beginning,
That's
potentially, of
yeah.
the process and kind of short, right? But
it's usually fairly quick, and it's usually all about how we're thinking.
Yeah.
Whereas then I talk about inventions, right? So I've actually produced something, right? I've made a technological device, or I've made a painting, or I've written a screenplay, or whatever.
or even lip balm.
or lip balm.
Right.
Exactly. So I've made something. So it's not just an idea in my head.
Yeah.
It's I've actually produced some sort of solution or resolution to a story.
And that's a really common. It strikes me that when we talk about creativity, we're really often talking about products, right, or things that we are tangible that we can sort of think about as.
But there's a third type though, and that's the thing that sort of surprised us. The more we thought about this, I think there's also in what we call them enlightenments. Like we learn things, right?
Yeah.
So I set about to study this, or we're making lip balm or whatever it is, and I learned something that goes well beyond lip balm or a watch or a mug, and I realized, there's an entirely new way of constructing something, or thinking about time, or understanding the human body, or wax, or what have you, and that goes beyond the product itself. And so an insight is a change to my current perspective, and an invention is really a resolution to my current story, and an enlightenment is a change to my knowledge.
Right.
So there's a product for each of those pieces
And
that we set up
has
already.
Downstream implications that could tie together a number of different products or perspectives that.
Right. They could
it's
change.
Almost like a paradigm shift.
They could change all the stories that I tell from here on out.
Right.
Exactly. So insights, enlightenments, and inventions. We'll talk about all three of them one at a time, starting with insights. Insights are realizations about how we might change our perspectives, or how we might start on building a new perspective. These can be everyday changes. They don't have to be anything dramatic or fancy. For example, I'll give you one of my more embarrassing moments. One day I was cleaning up after dinner and wanted to put some leftover food in the refrigerator, and I could not find any Tupperware. We have some plastic containers and some glass containers just for putting food away, and it seemed as if we were all out. So I was thinking about going to buy more, and then I was loading the dishwasher and noticed a mason jar on the top rack. Now, in my family, mason jars were used for one thing and one thing only: my mother's jam. It's the only thing I had ever put in a mason jar in my life. So the ordinary little insight that I had was that a mason jar is just a glass Tupperware container, just a different shape. So I share this amazingly dumb little insight to show you just how blind we can be to the possibilities all around us if we could only change our perspectives. Now, insights can also be astonishingly brilliant. So the classic example, maybe apocryphal, we don't really know, is the ancient Greek mathematician Archimedes getting into a bathtub and shouting, "Eureka!" Apparently, Archimedes was asked to assess whether an irregularly shaped crown was made of pure gold, or if some of the gold had been replaced by less valuable and lighter silver. So he went to take a bath, still puzzling over the problem, and upon entering the bath was struck with an insight that led him to shout "Eureka!" and run straight from the bath to the king. Now, Archimedes' insight was that the crown, when placed in water, should displace an amount of water equal to the volume of the crown. More specifically, if you take a balance scale and you set the crown on one side and an equal weight of pure gold on the other side, if you submerge the entire thing, the scale, the crown, the gold, in water, you should be able to tell if the crown and the gold are still in balance. If so, then the crown's weight and volume match the gold's weight and volume, and all is well. If not, well, all is not well for the crown's maker who stole some gold. For Archimedes, maybe he could have generated that insight in a flash, but the insight maybe was something more like water displacement. Now, it isn't obvious that if you are trying to figure out whether a crown is solid gold or water displacement is the key, but the insight might have changed his perspective and led him ultimately to work out the solution. Now, usually the solution to this problem is presumed to be concerned with testing how far water rises when the crown is submerged. However, the tiny difference in displaced water between pure gold and an impure crown would be hard to detect when spread across a surface area large enough to submerge an entire crown. And Archimedes, he was cleverer than that.
Insights are no better or worse for advancing our stories, for arriving suddenly. The suddenness might make it seem exciting and memorable, but it doesn't make it any better of a possibility for how to change our perspectives. After all, we have all kinds of sudden realizations that are not necessarily creative. Oh, that's where I left my keys, right? Thoughts that arrive suddenly are not necessarily insights. And it's also true that insights that arrive slowly can be every bit as important in where they allow our stories to go. It is just more exciting and more memorable when insights arrive suddenly.
When we have an insight, we're not necessarily generating an idea for how to solve a problem. We probably will not know where the insight will even take us. Instead, an insight is a realization about some aspect of our knowledge that is not currently part of our perspective, but that might be. An insight identifies knowledge that we could bring into our perspective to change it, or a direction in which we could go to build a new perspective. Usually, an insight gives us a way to change our perspectives so that our stories can progress in a new way. Insights can also reveal that a pathway that looked promising for our stories to take is actually terrible or impossible to traverse. Insights do not always expand our stories, at least in the short run. Just a simple example. I had a student from Hong Kong who graciously listened while I explained a project and said he understood what needed to be done next when we asked him to help. 2 weeks later, upon discovering the student had done nothing, I had a similar conversation. Another 2 weeks later, still nothing had happened. I went into the student's advisor's office, was pretty angry, to explain what was happening. And he smiled graciously and said that the problem was not with the lazy student, but with me and my own cultural blindness. The insight was that from the student's cultural perspective, he would be insulting me if he said no directly to taking on my project. Instead, he was providing all kinds of indirect hints that he could not possibly take on my project. I was just too blinded by my own cultural perspective to notice. In this case, the insight closed off a pathway in our story. Still, the insight made something inconceivable thinkable, and so changed where our story could go next. It made me believe a new perspective on culture, indirect communication, and realize there were different ways of saying no.
One crucial product of the creative process is an insight, which is an idea about changing our perspectives or building a new perspective. It's not a solution necessarily. It might not work. It might simply indicate that what we thought was a good way forward is actually not. But it is an important product of the creative process because it's the smallest unit of creativity. It's a shift in perspectives.
Yeah. So I think of it a little bit like turning and driving. So, you know, an insight is kind of like a plot twist in a story. It's like a turn when you're driving. So if you only go straight, you follow the road while you're driving, you can get to a few places, but not very many, right? But if you have that turn, if you have a plot twist, well then, you know, you can go in all these different directions and get to new places.
Although that, I guess, explains why it's so tempting to just stay on the straight and narrow, right?
Exactly.
The turns are a bit tricky, but that's where insights happen.
But that's an insight. That's the role of an insight, is to redirect your story in a new direction. So, of course, you know, if we're used to traveling and following this road, that's where we get. If we turn, we can get somewhere new. Of course, if all we do is turn, you don't get anywhere, right? So you need all of that ordinary thinking of just following the road to actually get anywhere. But but if you, and that's the role of insight, right? It's that small unit of creativity. It's that shift where maybe our story takes a left.
Right, but that turn's not necessarily enough in and of itself, right?
Yeah, and it might be a
Sometimes
dead
you need
end.
multiple turns. Speaking from experience. So.
And as you're right. And one turn usually is not enough to get anywhere.
Right.
Yeah. Normally you need more than one turn. Exactly. So sometimes we have an insight about how to change our perspectives, and that allow us to turn our story in a new direction, but it could be a dead end, and there might be more turns needed. But if we don't turn anywhere, we're not getting anywhere. And so we need those turns, we need those insights.